All right. Good evening. Let's make a start. I think. So we titled the shir "Ethical Warfare and Ethical Living." I think the idea is to try and get a sense of what perspectives the Torah provides us in the way and the manner of how the military, if you like, are meant to prepare for war. The references in the parsha to that, and how that is more has kind of more general implications for the ethical living in general. That's kind of the idea. That's the direction of travel here, if you like. So we're going to come in, obviously, the parsha, ki Teitzei milchama alevecha, right? That's the beginning of the parsha, and the whole very, very difficult topic of the Yefas Torah. You know, this whole idea of capturing this woman and being able to keep everything else. We'll come back to that in a moment. Let's first go to Perek Chof Gimel Pasuk Yud. If you're following in a Chumash, you have a very similar phrase in that pasuk, in that parsha. Ki Teitzei machaneh al oivecha. So when there's a camp which goes out al oivecha against your enemies, v'nishmarto mikol davar ra. You have to avoid anything bad, anything negative. Rashi understands that what does it mean v'nishmarto mikol davar ra? So Rashi understands shasoton mekatrei b'shas hasakona, that when there's a situation of danger, there's a possibility for the Satan to have an effect. So you've got to be particularly careful. And then the Torah goes on to describe the halachas that a soldier has to be careful of Tara, even in a situation when you would think that's not possible or difficult to do. Even so, that's essential to be careful about. We learn much from this. The idea that even the most mundane things in life, the idea they have to have a spade for necessary purposes, all of these things are not insignificant. They are significant in the Torah's eyes. But the Ramban adds something here on this v'nishmarta mikol davar ra. He brings Rashi, and then he says something slightly differently. He says, "V'hanochon be'enai be'inyan ha-mitzvah hazos." The correct thing in my eyes in this mitzvah is "Ke'akosav yazir be'is asher chet motzi bo." The Torah is emphasizing these words, v'nishmarta mikol davar ra, avoid anything negative, in a situation where chet, sin, doing the wrong thing, is likely to occur. He says the fact is that when it comes to camps, this word machane, right, an army camp that goes out against the enemies, the reality is, basically, normal ethical rules go out the window. They'll eat whatever the things they want. They will eat carrion and wild animals that they wouldn't be seen eating at normal times. They will steal. They will pillage. They will do all these things. And they're not embarrassed, even as far as niyaf, which presumably here is a reference to rape, all sorts of terrible things they will do. He says someone who is normal, the normal upright person, right, by nature, is somehow clothed in cruelty and wrath when in a situation of war, a situation of a battle against the enemy. And therefore, he says, so that's why the Torah specifically says, make sure you're careful about anything evil, anything bad, anything negative. I mean, it's a fascinating Ramban, because it's so easy to bring proof to this. There's to sort of bring almost like a contemporary frightening and terrifying example is a book called Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning. Ordinary Men was an analysis of Police Battalion 101. Police Battalion 101 was a Nazi. They were really the Einsatzgruppen, who were they were soldiers or recruited police almost, who used to follow the advance of the SS through Eastern Europe and through Poland and later on into Russia. And their job was, certainly the Jews they found, effectively, they were called upon to massacre the inhabitants. And the reason why this book is so both terrifying and important is because basically it details interviews with this particular battalion about what motivated them. They were interviewed after the war in great detail, these ordinary soldiers, how could they do this, and what led them, what was going through their minds when they carried out these orders to massacre these Jews in the forest and everything else. And he called the book Ordinary Men because these people seemed so ordinary. They seemed like these were not, hardcore recruited soldiers from their youth, as if they'd been trained in through the Hitler Youth, and then they'd become, committed to the ideology of the Nazis. These were ordinary men. These were people who were just ordinary guys who became involved, and in the context they were in, somehow were transformed into a walking nightmares, and being able to actually carry this out. And one of the scariest things about the book is that he details how at specific moments they were given the option to refuse to carry out the orders, and they were actually offered, and they would not have lost, it was acceptable for them to say, I can't do this, and nevertheless, the majority, even the vast majority, went along with it. Agreed to carry out the orders as they were given. So that's, I think, a really powerful example of the Ramban. And if you want to go, of course, further, although we don't generally do contemporary events in this Parsha Shiur, I mean, you look at a situation of war, you look at what's transpired over the last few weeks. The most horrific things can occur in situations of battle, of tension, and everything else. So that's the Ramban. So that's how the Ramban understands, but especially need to be especially careful. Now, if we go back to the Kliyokar at the beginning of the Parsha, Posach of Aleph, Perek of Aleph, Posach Yud, the Kliyokar asks a number of kashas on the way the Parsha begins. The Parsha begins with those words, Teitzei la milchama alevecha. And the Kliyokar says, there's several problems I've got here, he says. Number one, he says, why does it say ki teitzei when you go out? Should have said ki telech when you go, right? What's going out? What's that got to do with it? Or it should say ki tilchom when you fight, right? What's la milchama? It should say lilchom, to fight. What's la milchama? To the war, right? La milchama implies that you're only going, you're fighting to see. He says, right, boss? You just come to see the battle. He says, he says, if it doesn't seem to say, it seems to be that you're not actually fighting. You're just coming to observe. He says that's what the word la milchama implies. Not actually. It should have said lilchom if you're actually fighting. Why does it say al oivech? What's al oivech? It should say keneged oivech, opposite your enemy. So he goes on, he asks a number of questions like this, and he gives two different explanations. The first explanation he gives links to this Ramban, and he says like this. He says the Ramban, as we just saw, explains this idea that v'nishmarta mikol dohora implies keeping yourself back from anything negative at all. And in fact, the continuation of that Ramban, which he quotes, is dovora can go so far as reading, as I think he quotes, I think the Ramban quotes possibly even quotes this way, quotes a Sifriya Medrash, that dovora can be read as dibur ra, a negative word, even being careful about negative speech, about lashon hara, right? And he says like this, what is going on here? He says, because if there's infighting, if there's lashon hara, if there's dovar ra, if there's negativity, if there's evil, if there's bad things going on within the army itself, the machane itself, what happens is they end up receiving a more serious blow than they would receive, or they could receive from the enemy themselves, He says, if there's no peace amongst the army, they're going to be, that's it, they're finished. They're going to be victorious over them immediately. Okay, and he brings the classic example by Sheni, right? What is one of the, if not the actual primary cause of the Churban, right? It's the Bayonim, it's the people who basically decide on themselves to burn the supplies that they had in Yerushalayim, right? Because they disagree with what the Rabbanim were saying, and the leaders of the city were saying, we've got to keep the storehouses for the siege. And they said, no, we want to fight, so they burn them up. So it's the infighting which destroys the potential for victory, okay? And he says, that's why it says ki teitzei, right? It means when you depart from that internal battle that's occurring within the city. He says, the idea the Torah is trying to say is, ki teitzei la milchoma alovecha, when you go out for war against your enemies, but inside the city, inside, toich ha'er, preserve the peace. There must be peace. Ki Teitzei la milchama. The battle is only outside. Don't bring that battle that has to take place, in certain cases, has to take place outside. Don't bring that battle into the city, right? Make sure you preserve the peace within the city. And that's why he uses that phrase. And he says, you should only go la milchama. Ki Teitzei la milchama. Go towards battle. Don't be in a situation where you are going from an existing battle, which is within the city. Make sure the battle is only outside. And only al oivecha. Go against your enemies, not on those you love, not on those you're close to. Only those where you need to fight. Don't go against people who you should be close to as much as possible. That's the Kliyokar, linking that to the Ramban. The need to preserve and the importance of preserving the peace that exists within the city itself. I think he's understanding that Yitzia is emphasizing that battle should only be a departure from where you are, like take it away almost from. And of course, you are going towards war, but it should be you should be deliberately seen as sort of removing it from the city where there should be no battle within the city. Yeah. The one further example, which almost like completes the circle of this, is the Baal HaTurim at the beginning of the parsha as well. The Baal HaTurim says, why is the Egla Rufa between the two? Ki Teitzei la milchama leivach. Everyone knows laning. This is the classic parsha for the Baal Kara to get the mistake, because you've got, towards the end of, it's really, I think in Shishi, of Shoftim, you've got Ki Teitzei la milchama leivach. It starts exactly the same way. Spoke about this on Shabbos, what it means in the preparation for war, and the way the Kohen tells them how to behave and what they have to do and who has to leave and shouldn't get involved. In between, you've got Kisei then you've got the Egla Rufa, and then you've got the second Kisei, which is our parish. Why is it, says the Baal HaTurim, that the Egla Rufa is between the two? He says like this, because you can have someone who is a enemy of someone else, and he says like this, it's a time of war, I can get away with anything now. I don't like this guy, so I'll do away with him. We're in war now. The wartime mode is different. I can get away with whatever I want. And I'll just say, well, he was killed in battle, so what can we do? It's time of war. In war, things happen. It was one of the enemies. What can I? That's the concern, and that's why it says afterwards, you have the Torah is saying, make sure, as the end of Parsha Shoftim says, right? And then you can be victorious in war. Only if you remove that innocent blood, the dam hanoki, make sure there is no bloodshed within you, within your city, and within places where it shouldn't be, and then you'll be victorious in battle. And that's why it's specifically in, if you like, sandwiched between the two battles, the two wars that take place. So that's the Torah's perspective on Kisei la milchama leivach. Linking all these two together, Ramban and Ishmael and Kol Devara, Afil Lashon Hara, between, you have to be sure you keep the machane of the army clean even from that. The Kliyachar expressing that if there's no peace within those who are, within waging war, there's no chance of being victorious of the enemies. And then the Baal HaTurim saying, first sort out your own house, sort out the problems that should not be transpiring in your own place and in the city, and only then you have a chance against your enemies. So you hold that all in mind. And now let's try and understand a little bit about this parsha of the Yafas Torah, because it is incredibly difficult to understand. Right? On the second positive, you see in captivity, this woman of beautiful form, and you're allowed to take her as a wife. And of course, the Torah gives a very specific procedure that needs to take place. But even with all of that, it still remains incredibly difficult to understand. You have to remember, as the Mefarshim point out, who is going to war? Who's going to war, right? The Kohen gets up and he says, last week's Parsha, anyone who has the three different categories of people, right? You have married, whatever. And then also anyone who is worried about Averos Sheviyod, anyone who's worried about any sin, something they may have done, which might have a negative effect on their ability to fight the battle, they can also leave and they can hide amongst all the others so no one knows that they've gone because they're worried about Averos they might have committed. So one second. So who's left? Who's actually going to war? Like the tzaddikim, right? The top guys are there in the the people who don't have any, shouldn't have to, this idea that they'd be faced with this impossible moral dilemma in battle, and therefore they have to have a solution found for them. It's an astonishing parsha, right? Now Rashi says, very, very well-known Rashi, Lo dibra Torah keneged Yetzirah. The Torah is only speaking keneged the Yetzirah. Shemeina Kodesh Baruch Hu matira. Had Hashem not allowed this, Yisrael be'isur, he would marry her be'isur. He would do it anyway. He would be with her anyway. But the Torah is warning you that if he does marry her, it's not going to turn out well. He'll end up detesting her, because the parsha afterwards is Kisen al-ish shtei, right? Etc. 2 wives. And then he ends up hating one. The Sofer and Ben Sora Mora, and you end up with a Ben Sora Mora. Rashi links the parshas in this way, and that's why they are all together in this manner. But I saw, as I said, it's still incredibly difficult. What does that mean? So that there is here a Yetzirah which is impossible to do anything about, and therefore the Torah says a particular solution. I saw a beautiful shot that Rav Fran quotes from Yechezkel Abramsky, and he says like this. This phrase, lo dibra Torah elo keneged Yetzirah, right? You translate that literally, it means the Torah is speaking opposite the Yetzirah. Now, had the explanation been that it's like a concession, that's how we normally understand it, right? Lo dibra Torah elo keneged Yetzirah is like a concession, right? Here, what can we do, right? It's a concession. There's nothing you can do. The Torah has to provide a solution because he's going to give in anyway to the Yetzirah, so therefore this is the only way to solve it, right? It should have been, if that was the idea, says Yechezkel Abramsky, it should have said, Lo dibra Torah elo ba'ad Yetzirah, right? It's almost like for the benefit, we're like supporting the Yetzirah. We're not keneged, we're not opposite the Yetzirah, we're not opposing the Yetzirah here. Yechezkel Abramsky says a very beautiful idea. Ultimately, what this parsha demonstrates is something profoundly against the Yetzirah. Because so many situations in life, we are faced with this extreme temptation to succumb, to do the wrong thing, to succumb to the Yetzirah. And there's this little voice in our heads which basically says, this is impossible. No one can withstand this. It's impossible. The temptation is too great. It's too difficult to resist. And that is why what the Torah is demonstrating here with this parsha is coming to say against that, opposite, keneged that. Because the Torah is saying there is only one situation in life. There is only the case of the Yafas Torah, where the Torah says, I am telling Hashem, is saying, I understand this particular situation, this particular scenario, there has to be a solution of the Yafas Torah. There has to be a solution of the Yafas Torah. There is a certain level of impossibility here, perhaps bound up in the whole nature of war, the extreme nature of war, where, as I started off, mentioned that whole, the studies that have been done into the literally unfathomable human behavior in war. Not that makes it excusable at all, but just the reality of the situation of war. And therefore the Torah is saying, this is specifically keneged the Yetzirah, because the Torah is saying only here, only in this situation, does the Torah need to provide that, so to speak, the bending the rules, if you like, almost, for the Yetzirah in this situation. Hashem is saying, I know every single scenario in life, and I know that you have the power, and you have the potential. In a normal situation, you have the potential to overcome. It may be difficult, it may be challenging. Sheva Yipol Tzadik V'kom takes, you fall again, and you get up again, and you try again. That's life, but the fact is the possibility is always there. In which case, really, the Parsha of Yafas Torah is actually a chizuk, because it's saying, we can strengthen ourselves internally to be able to combat the Yetzirah. War is a situation of extremes in every respect. But without war, not in a situation of war, we are able to oppose it. We have the ability to live ethically. And the idea that the Torah is expressing through all of these Rishonim that we've seen is that warfare needs to be conducted as ethically as possible. Immensely difficult. So that the soldiers have to go to this extreme, even be very careful about Lashon Hara, to try and somehow preserve their inherent moral compass. And even then, sometimes they lose it. And there's going to be the Yafas Torah. But in a normal situation, the Torah is telling us you can live ethically. You can live in a moral way. You don't have to give in. You don't have to succumb. The idea of needing to keep that and preserve that strength, that inner strength, and the idea of having that sense of preparing oneself and not being in a situation where one falls into a scenario which can corrupt one sort of in ruchnius and spirituality, which can lead to a negative outcome, is also expressed, I think, very powerfully later on in the parsha. Another Rashi, Chof Gimel, Posuk Tes. Rashi says that Rashi brings the contrast here between Ammon and Moav and the Edom and the Mitzrayim, right? So Rashi says, where is it? Chof Gimel Tes. What's the difference? So in when it comes to Ammon and Moav, yeah. Even the 10th generation, they cannot come near, whatever. And why? Because they didn't come near to Belechem of Mayim. And Lo Sidra Shlom, don't go, you can't seek the good or peace for them at all, ever they're finished. Whereas when it comes to the Adomim, Lo Sasav Adomi and Lo Sasav Mitzri, right? You can't detest them, you mustn't detest them, it's not the same, right? After a certain number of generations, they can enter Klal Yisrael. What's the difference? Says Rashi. Rashi says, other nations are permitted immediately. So you've got the three levels. You've got everyone else. You've got the Adomim and the Mitzrayim, and then you've got the Ammon and Moav, the worst of all, if you like. Says Rashi, someone who causes someone else to sin, it's worse than killing him. Somebody kills him in this world. Someone who causes him to sin, he takes him out of this world and also out of Olam Haba as well. Edom who came with the sword should not be detested. The Mitzrayim who threw them in try to drown them. Even so, they should not be detested forever. But these who led them to sin, who caused them to sin, these who tried Ammon and Moav with their plotting and the planning with the Benos, right? The Benos Midjan and the whole thing, this is the whole idea of the Benos Moav. This was something which was designed to implant that damage in their morality, their moral compass, and that is something which is unforgivable. To corrupt someone else, to lead someone else, to corrupt someone else spiritually, that's impossible. That's something which is it's so devastating, so devastating. It prevents that sense of what it means to live a moral and ethical life. You're not giving them a chance, and that's what they wanted to do. And that is why there is this distinction. On the surface, you would think if you set out to kill someone, that must be worse. They can't survive. But no, on a certain level, Rashi is telling us that to prevent a person having that independent moral, ethical sense, that's even more frightening, that's even more terrifying, and that can do even more damage. One final idea, which I think is also connected, right at the end of the parsha, or towards the end actually, not right at the end, Chof Daled Perek Chof Daled Posuk Ches and Tes, you have the juxtaposition of Hishomer Benega HaTzoras. Be careful about Tzoras, Lishmo Ma'od V'Lasos, Kechol HaSheiros Chamakonim, V'Shetzis Tishmu Lasos. You have to be exceptionally careful to follow everything the Kohanim tell you to do in respect of the laws of Tzoras. And then, Zochar Eis Asher Osa Hashem Lekech LaMiriam V'Derech L'Nitzcham Mitzrayim. Remember what Hashem did to Miriam. And the idea, as Rashi says, is that you want to be careful not to come near to getting Tzoras. Don't speak Lashon Hara. Remember what Miriam did. Miriam spoke against her brother, and as a result, and she received Tzoras as a result. Okay. Now the question here is, why is the episode of Miriam the best or the archetype example not to speak Lashon Hara? It's not really the worst case. It's not really the worst case scenario in terms of Lashon Hara. The Ramban points this out. Look at the Ramban. The Ramban says, he brings the same as Rashi, and he says this is a mitzvah saseh, just like you have Zochar Yom HaShabbos, Zochar Yom HaZeh Shel Tzosim Mitzrayim, Zochar Yisrael L'chol Amalek. He lists this as one of the mitzvah saseh d'oraisa to remember the Ma'aseh Miriam. Then he says, you need to remember the serious punishment that Miriam received, the Miriam the Neviah received. She spoke only about her brother, who she dearly loved, and she only wanted it for his. She wanted it effectively. He uses the phrase "gemul chasta." She wanted to do kindness to him. She didn't speak in front of him that he should be shamed or embarrassed. Nor in front of the public. Only between her and her brother in private, who was also holy like her. Nothing helped her. If you try and say the wrong thing about someone else, you won't be safe. It can't be anything positive. It can't be good from it, because you won't be safe from it. Because at the end of the day, we see that even someone who was so kodesh, was so holy, even so, by speaking Lashon Hara, look what happened. Look what happened to her. So she speaks about Moshe Rabbeinu, but as the Ramban points out, it's not really the worst case, the worst example of Lashon Hara, and yet that's used as the archetype example. Why is that? I once heard many years ago, from a Rav in Yerushalayim who was close to Becheskel Weinfeld, and he says that the idea is that fundamentally every case of Lashon Hara comes through judging someone else. That's what happens. It comes through coming and jumping to a conclusion and saying, I think I know why X, Y, Z, or why this person did this such and such a thing, and therefore there must be something negative behind it. So the reason why the example of Miriam is the archetype example of Lashon Hara is specifically because Miriam jumps to conclusions. What she said was that why did Moshe Rabbeinu separate himself from his wife? Halo Gambonu Diber. So she thinks she understands the situation. Hashem says to her, there's a total difference. I speak to him directly. I've told him to act in this way. There is a qualitative distinction between your nevuah and his nevuah. You didn't understand it properly. You misjudged it. So the idea is that Miriam's example is the archetype case that can lead to Lashon Hara, because it goes back to the root cause. Strengthening internally, we're not in a situation of challenge. We're not in a situation where there is this critical moment, or the temptation, if you like, to speak Lashon Hara, that allows to be able to rise to the challenge when we are actually tested, when there comes the temptation, the real temptation to speak Lashon Hara. I think this links to this idea of there is a need to, the army particularly, are encouraged, are commanded, v'nishmartem mikol davar ra, as we began with the Rambam, be exceptionally careful. The Rambam says, even Lashon Hara specifically, be exceptionally careful not to speak Lashon Hara. Make sure you raise yourselves to an ethical level so that when you are faced with that challenge, when you have that, your fast tire in front of you, when you have that challenge, you are in a situation of war, which is so easy. It's so easy to fall. It's so easy to say, to give up. There's nothing to even so try. You can try and rise up against it. And similarly, when it comes to the parsha of Miriam, and talk about Lashon Hara in general, the Torah is telling us, put those places, put those things in place before the moment of challenge. The idea of not judging someone else, working on not judging. Who says? Mi yodea. Do I understand? Do I know everything? Do I really understand? So that when the challenge comes to sort of say the wrong thing about someone else, you are at least well prepared. You have a chance to overcome it, because one has trained oneself not to prejudge and therefore not to misjudge a situation. The idea being that the lessons we learn from ethical warfare actually can teach us what it means to live an ethical life as well. Okay, thank you all for joining, and have a very good Shabbos.
Shkoyach, Rabbi. Shalom Aleichem. Welcome back. Shkoyach.
Alaikum Shalom. Thanks a lot. Take care.